Welcome to everyone who are joining via the recording. We're now just starting the discussion for the model, continuing from last time about identifiers and titles. So last time we talked about identifiers and sort of the core identity information for objects. I'm going to share my screen, particularly for the recording. So hopefully now you should all see the identifier page in the model for objects. And we had a particularly good discussion in the, or if not discussion, then everyone was super prompt at getting their homework done. Thank you again, everyone, for that. And putting in the list of types of identifier and types of title that we use. So I think there's no need to go back over the model itself, unless anyone wants to.
Rob,
Mm-hmm.
This is George Lambert. I sent out an email, which I would like to apologize to everyone in the group. Was actually, I should not have responded to it the way that I did, suggesting that there is a good discussion to have about URIs and potential issues with long-term persistence and link rot,
Mm-hmm.
and some solutions for that. And I asked if there was anyone interested in me putting together some presentations and some documentation to help people better understand that. Is there any interest in that by anyone?
Yeah, I think that would be useful to do. I think we should go through the modeling side of identifiers first before getting into the persistence nature, because yeah, as I'm sure most folks are aware, the persistence of identifiers and the persistence of content is a challenge even for cultural heritage institutions or memory institutions. So having a discussion about how best to do that, or even not necessarily how best, but what are the possible routes for making that as strong as possible, certainly seems valuable.
Well, I wanted to bring some vocabulary and context into the discussion without actually talking about any of our specific solutions,
mm-hmm.
but
Yeah.
helping people understand the underlying vocabulary so they can talk about it in an educated way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
if anyone is interested in reading that, I will prepare it.
I think that would be great.
Perfect.
Perfect. Right. So yeah, we can when you've had a chance to think about that and do a review, just yeah, shoot me an email and we can make sure that you've got the appropriate time on the agenda to talk through it. Okay, so for the vocabulary in a different sense, so the types of identifier and Python. One of the things that I noted from the sets of types was that there's a lovely great deal of overlap between all of our institutions, which is superb, and thankfully again most of the different types that people have sort of at the general level are already identified in AAT, so no need to go and talk to the vocabulary folks to ask them to add new ones for those new terms for those types. But of course, both here at the Getty and at Chin and others, I'm certain, had a lot of very specific identifiers, such as the Borden identifier. We have loop identifiers for auctions, and we have the Peruvian National Artwork Registry identifier for some objects even, which I had never heard of before I talked to our collections manager about this last week. Which, strangely enough, there isn't an AAT term for the Peruvian National Art Registry. You'll be shocked to hear. I think the question that I would love to get your opinions on is the extent to which we should be coming to agreement and then documenting that agreement about the vocabulary terms to use and the extent to which we can simply say, here is the model, and you can put whatever vocabulary in that you want. Since I'm talking, I'll throw out a starter opinion. My opinion would be that we should identify or vocabulary terms for all of the things which are shared by all of the types that are shared by more than sort of 2 or 3 institutions. So, we need a primary title, we need translated title, we need alternate titles, we would need accession number and system number, artist or creator identifier or title, that sort of thing. But Peruvian National Art Registry, I'm surprised that we have it. I would be even more surprised if anyone else had it. So that sort of thing, we shouldn't make the uber list of all possible identifiers and titles and art object types and so forth. Instead, we should focus on the areas where interoperability is the important thing, and hence the shared nature is when that becomes important, rather than the union of all lists. So that's my perspective, but I'm very happy. I would love to hear what everyone else is thinking about what we do with these sets of vocabulary types.
Why would you not want to add the Peruvians if they're I mean, they have just as much a claim on having an identifier as anybody else. And they probably have the best identifier for Peruvian items.
Is the question here whether or not we should use these identifiers in our data, or whether or not the linked art as a set of best practices provides a preferred identifier for Peruvian artwork names?
More the latter than the former. Yeah, so to try to explain explain my question a little bit better. It's not whether or not we should be able to include the Peruvian registry or not. Clearly, if there's data that people have collected and manage, it's important to them, and it's important to be able to be represented. However, is it important for us to create the union list of all possible things that anyone wants to say, as opposed to the intersection of things that people want to say, and then to what extent do we need to take into account that intersection? So, for example, if there's only one institution that has a particular sort of title, then as a specification, as a data model, as a group, do we need to document and bless that one vocabulary term, or given that it is an open model, you can use your own vocabulary terms. You can use, and maybe there's even AAT terms for the sorts of things that people want to say. But what I would be reluctant to do is to reproduce all AAT plus all of the other terms that we might run into in the linked art documentation and model. Because then we've got hundreds of thousands of vocabulary things, and everyone looks at it and says, "Oh dear, this is very long and complicated and unusable." So,
well, Rob, I'm a little unsure now, because I think it was a really good way of phrasing the question, or at least it seemed clear to me. But it seems like we're conflating at least two things there, and one is, what kind of support do we need to have for outliers who have particular kinds of titles, let's say, or other kinds of things we might need to model in the model, versus what kind of support for choosing from vocabularies, so just the use of particular identifiers in links. And those seem to me to be two different things.
yes.
It seems to me that we'd want to separate those things, because in the former case, the question you raise is really the important one. I'm not offering an opinion on that. I just want to recognize it. And then in the latter case, it seems to me that it's a little bit different, because from a linked data point of view, I'm not sure why we'd want to, or to what degree we would want to say, well, don't use these kinds of identifiers, which is essentially what we'd be saying. So I think there's two questions there.
Yeah, or not even don't use these sorts of identifiers, but we're not providing a recommendation about how to identify the type of identifier. And you can use however you feel comfortable.
Well, no, right. That's what I would want. I'm saying that if we do anything other than that, we are implicitly saying don't use these identifiers. I think we're in agreement. We're just saying it too very clearly. Yeah, then it comes down to a question more about, well, okay, here's this particular structure for a title or some other, piece of interesting information or way of declaring it. What are the boundaries of support for that? Would it be fair to rephrase your question in that way?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that is it perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, good. So it's not so much picking winners and losers amongst vocabularies as when people have very, very unusual cataloging practices, or they're just a little less usual than how far do we go?
Yeah. Where's the line between so obvious that everyone needs it, like primary title, and so obscure that only one institution needs it? Where is the lovely fine line that we can look to in terms of which ones we need to come to consensus on and which ones we don't? Which ones can simply be local practice and fit with the model because it's vocabulary as opposed to classes within the ontology.
I'm sorry.
I guess, again, to try to clarify what I think the question is, I think we are saying that the model that we have allows us to describe any kind of identifier, which is useful because it means at the structural level, we'll all describe our identifiers the same way. If we want a deeper level of interoperability, we may also declare that a particular vocabulary term is what we all as a consensus mean is, say, a session number. We all have session numbers. Should Linked Art take an opinion that says, say, the Getty vocabulary's ID for a session number is the type that we will all use when describing that kind of identifier? Or is that a bridge too far into picking a winner? And we want to say, here is just a pattern that we use to describe identifiers. What vocabulary you use to type those identifiers is an open question that we aren't taking an opinion on.
Yeah, or indeed. To what extent should we take an opinion on it? If we take no opinion and everyone uses different things, then we know it's an identifier, but you can't even generate a user interface that says accession number. we certainly couldn't easily.
Might
However,
I express a non-institutional technology perspective on this just for a moment? Because I'm not an institution, but I do have a technology perspective.
Yep. Go ahead.
So the approach taken by schema.org is to think of inheritance of things. So you can have a person, you can have an organization, you can have an event, you can have an object. And then if you want more specific details, you can inherit from other similar types of objects within the hierarchy. So if we have a base description of an object, anyone who wants to put their own custom tags on them inherits from the higher level object, and it's defined both as the higher level object and your local vocabulary sits on top of that, but you get all of the benefits of the defined top level object without too much clutter, and clarity that your specific record types have additional metadata. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, that's exactly the same situation that we have here. And the question it really is, to what extent do we put things into the schema.org level model and set of recommendations, and to what extent do we just leave it open and allow people to use whatever they want?
Right. So my thinking on that is that you create a base minimum type, and then the inheritance for extra attributes that are used by an institution, and then the institution's attributes all end up within that institution or group of institutions that wish to inherit from it as a family, but you can always trace back the hierarchy for extra attributes without cluttering the parent object. So you really treat it as atomic elements and compounds. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I can paste into the notes like how a clip could be a movie clip, a radio clip, a video clip, a TV clip, a news clipping out of a magazine. Those are all different things that could be called a clip of something, but they're really taken from a thing and attached.
So this kind of subsumption is pretty standard in the kinds of ontologies that we deal with. And I think it's a useful technique, but I don't think it quite gets at the problem that Rob is pointing at. If I suspect rightly, Rob, you're talking more about what we do, how we consume this data. So if we want to build useful applications with this data, we have to be able to make assumptions across the data, that is. And if every data part has a completely different set of properties or properties that don't really align, even if they're very well described, even if we know exactly how they don't align and in what ways they are distinct, and we can point at different categorizations of those distinctions, it doesn't help us build the application, or it makes it no easier to build the application. And at the same time, it's obviously not realistic to just say, okay, we're all going to use exactly the same vocabulary internally and externally, and that'll just solve that problem. We have to find a good, comfortable balance in between, and I would suggest that the way to find that is to concentrate on those uses. So if we want particular kinds of uses across this aggregation of data that we're considering constructing, then we need to be able to make certain kinds of assumptions. And if we want to make weaker uses, make a weaker assumption, and so on and so forth. So I think without considering the uses to which we want to put this data, it's very hard to answer the kind of subtle question, Rob, that you've posed, because we're not sure just how much alignment we need to buy. Alignment has a cost, but how much of it do we need? It's hard to say without knowing what we want to do with the data in the end,
Mm-hmm.
or at least having some notions that we can guide by.
Yeah, that is a great point.
So, sorry, I was wondering if I can offer a contribution. I mean, the problem that we've got about the types of identifiers will also be a problem no matter what the type of thing we're talking about. So whenever we have types, that problem will come up. And I always thought about that problem as a separate issue to the model. The model offers the basic sort of properties we need to describe identifiers. I always thought that when we start talking about types of things, we need a separate area where we align these types with each other. So if somebody's using a separate thesaurus to the Getty AAT, there's an exercise to make sure that the identifier types in that thesaurus align properly with the identifier types in the Getty. So the application would then need to basically undertake another query, figure out the alignment on the thesauri, and then present one item that's common to everyone. So it's the thesaurus. I always saw the thesaurus alignment as a separate task to the modeling task.
Yeah, no, that's a very good description of the issue. So yeah, I think the model that we discussed last time for identifier is pretty reasonable, or titled. Just to look at the title model on the screen, you know, we have the object which is identified by a name, which has some content, peasant and sheep in this case, and it's classified as, and here comes the vocabulary, AAT 300404670, which we include the fact that this is a type, and that the label for this vocabulary term is primary name. So the fact that it has the label is here nor there. It's the URI 300404670, that which is the vocabulary term that, if you want to Adam's point, construct a user interface or do any sort of use the data in any reasonable way, you need to understand that this is primary name, and the fact that some institutions call it main title, some call it primary title, some call it, I don't know other ones off the top of my head, but to what extent should we be agreeing on these terms at the vocabulary level, and to what extent should we be focusing on just the structure, to David's point? You know, this seems like a very reasonable structure for titles and identifiers, but without the vocabulary to know what sort of title it is, have we solved anyone's actual problem? I would say that unless we have at least some basic consensus about the types, then we haven't really solved anyone's problem. But equally, we can't get consensus on absolutely all of everyone's types.
Rob, would it make sense to just try to have it both ways, in terms of, say, requiring one identifier, having a preferred set of types of identifiers to choose from, you know, maybe because it's our preference, mapping from AAT or a single source, but then allowing certainly all these other things in. So then we would just have to map, you know, decide on the basic set of, say, 5 types of identifiers that are most common, and those, we would recommend one of those as the first one you put in, and then of course you could put in others.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I think I personally lean sort of more towards what Thanasis was suggesting, if I'm remembering who was saying it, that we're talking about 2 problems here. One is this structural alignment, and I think that we have to, you know, that's the real thing we're providing. I think what we're saying, at least what I'm hearing us say, is that we're asking for a second type of alignment here, which is a sort of a codification of a set of base types that we use to describe these things, to aid not in using the same model, but to aid in interoperability between instances of this model. So I think, you know, I would lean to say that, you know, we have a set of, if you want to talk about a session number and you agree with us what an accession number is, or rather you agree with the AAT what an accession number is, we recommend that you use these sets of terms to describe those patterns because it will aid in interoperability. It isn't to say that you can't use your internal vocabulary as well, but I think the question for me is, do we want to require that if you're talking about a session, you agree with the AAT's definition of what that is? Or do we want that to be just more in the sort of should or recommended, or as a base crosswalk to build from?
Yeah, and if you don't agree with the definition, then yeah, absolutely, we shouldn't be trying to force anyone to change what their cataloging practices are, or what their definitions are, because that's an impossible task, because it would mean recataloguing everything, and we certainly don't want to even, I would say, even discuss that as a possibility. No one would have the resources to do that. So yeah, having the set of sort of definitions of what terms we recommend and what the definitions are, so that you can know whether or not you should use them. That to me is I agree, the right degree of specification, and the extent to which we do that, the amount of time that we spend on trying to agree or not about accession number. I mean, that's an easy one. I think we would all reasonably agree on that one quite quickly. How much effort do we want to spend on that versus how much effort do we want to spend on the structure? I think is really the question. And yeah, I think I've heard that a reasonable consensus around that. We need to do some, but we shouldn't try to do too much.
I mean, one technique for this that I've seen used, and it is not always, that effective, but is converting. In other words, taking the kind of problem that you were just describing, Rob, like what kind of accession number is this, and typing it in such a way that you do have a subsumption of properties there. Now, the problem with that immediately is that it looks a lot like inference. It looks a lot like you're suddenly making a very different technical demand on people who are working with the data. So I'm not a big fan of that, but that is one approach people do take. So saying that there is some kind of Linked.art blessed, type for an accession number that is very generic, and then saying perhaps there are more specific, kinds of types of accession number. But that's as well as I do, and I think folks here who work with development on a day-to-day basis know that that's a problematic road.
Yep.
Can I? It seems to me that so as you all have said, there are two questions, but it seems to me that to this group at least, being able to agree on the definition of types is kind of a low-hanging fruit, isn't it? I can't really talk to the structural alignment and how that might diverge from one model to the next, but I can certainly say, even though the label of primary name doesn't reflect our practice at Yale, I agree with the intellectual definition for that thing.
Yep.
Right? It seems to me that that's a that might be time consuming because it means debating the AT scope notes essentially, but I think everybody around the table can at least take a stab at that.
Yep.
I think this is a good point. As a group, perhaps it's more useful to focus on the modeling, agreeing on the model, and the alignment with Zora. I think it's the task that perhaps it's easy to do, each sort of institution individually.
You were breaking up. I think it was Vanessa's.
Sorry, can you hear me better now?
A little bit.
Probably not. A little bit. I was just saying that perhaps the thesaurus alignment task is easier to undertake for an institution on its own, as it were, whereas the modeling task makes sense to undertake as a
Yep. Agreed. So perhaps if we, so here's a suggestion for a route forwards, to avoid having this discussion over and over again. If, as we're going through the model, the structure, there will very frequently be this call out to vocabulary to clarify the sort of identifier, or the sort of object, or the sort of dimension even. So if we use the calls for talking about the structure and the list for people to then, as we did over this last couple of weeks, to send, here is the types of the thing that we've talked about that we have, then we can build some spreadsheets and have some perhaps on list discussions rather than on call discussions about the nature of all of those vocabularies, such that we can come to a list of, there is, the majority of institutions have a main title, and I would imagine that 100% have a main title. Probably the majority have an alternate title, and some have a translated title, and I'm sure we have some crazy title that no one else has. And then down the line, once we've really solidified the structure, the terminology can sort of percolate along in the background, and we can return to it to say, okay, now that we have everything working, where can we then get additional agreement about those types? And as we are, for people who are implementing, hopefully during the process, as opposed to waiting for everything to be finished, we can then use that sort of implementation experience to drive the cross-institutional alignment of the vocabulary work, or the terminology work, rather than trying to do it in a vacuum. To Adam's point, it's hard to know what we need to do without, to what extent we need to have alignment when we don't know what the use cases and implementation requirements are. So we know, I think, without any work, that we will need to align on primary, some notion of a primary title or a primary name. Because without that, you can't even build the simplest user interface that puts the title at the top, as opposed to any other particular name that may be not desired. So, I think we know we need to at least agree on that level, and I don't think that level of agreement is going to be particularly hard. And then if we can have use cases and implementation experience to drive what else needs to be agreed upon, but at the same time capture the extent of things that could be agreed upon, that might be a way forwards. What do people think to that?
Iterative is good.
And I think thinking about it as two separate problems here. One is the need to, in this sort of linked data graph way, manage things that would traditionally be handled by more concrete properties or more concrete things like arrays and ordering, like the notion of primariness or the notion of artworkiness, both of which are these core concepts. those are the as things that absolutely must be specified because we don't want to mint complicated properties for things. And keep as a second thing the idea that what we also really want is interoperability at the data level, to say that when I'm talking about an accession number and you're talking about an accession number, we're talking about the same thing, which dramatically improves our ability to have data from multiple institutions be interoperable in the same interfaces. So I think we do have these two different ways that we're using types. And maybe, I think, I agree with Rob, we may be overly nuancing this, but I see those as two different problems that we're trying to solve. And I want to make sure we don't blend them.
Any further discussion on this one?
I would just like to confirm my understanding of this kind of the scope of the model. One of the end goals is to be able to represent the entire contents of a current CMS system using the linked art model, right? And so if that's the case, and if somebody like the NGA has not really used some of these vocabularies that that the usage side of this problem is considering, it shouldn't. I don't think that should be a requirement for leveraging the model.
Yeah, yes, agreed. To borrow a term from AAAF, the level 0 implementation, the most simple implementation that you can do, would never use any shared terminology and only use the structure. So you could have your own internal identifiers for all of the vocabulary entries and not use AAT or any other shared vocabulary at all. And we shouldn't prevent that. That would be silly and impossible, in fact, right? There's all you need to do to avoid using the recommended terms would be to say, well, we disagree with the definition of AAT's primary name, and hence we're going to use something else. So it should be, Dave, to your point, it should be possible to represent in the structure all of the bits of information that we manage in our collection management systems. And then it should be possible on top of that, so there's your level 0, it should be possible on top of that to have interoperability between systems when there is agreement about the meaning of the data as opposed to the structure of the data. So I possibly should have thought through all of that about an hour ago. But yeah, I think that is the question. So to your point, yes, I think we need to be able to express everything using the structure, and it should be possible to have a consistent representation of the semantics, the types, the vocabulary, within that structure for the common things that we can all agree upon. And then maybe there's another list somewhere else where it's like, and here are some other possibilities that you might want to consider. Does that speak to your question?
Yeah. Yep.
Cool. All right, it is the top of the hour. If there's time for one more comment or question. Nope. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. A departure from the previous sort of walking through the structural side of things this week, but one that I think is worth calling out early so that we can all be on the same page with our understanding of structure versus vocabulary, model versus vocabulary. And I think will set us up for making faster, better progress in the weeks to come. So thank you to George and Philippe for the notes, and look forward to seeing some of you next week here, and everyone else in either 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on if we swap the week that we have the call on, if that makes it easier for some folks to join. Okay. So thanks everyone, and we'll speak again soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.